Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of the Burndy MRC 840 heavy duty quadruple aught gauge capacity wire crimpers. These actually go from a variety of capacities all the way from 8 gauge right through quadruple aught gauge. And quadruple aught's pretty darn large. The actual wire itself would be a ½ inch or a little bit larger in diameter without insulation. So obviously for heavy duty conductors, the beautiful thing about this is that it is an adjustable wire crimper with multiple dies that allows you to go from such a wide range from wires. As you can see how large this quadruple aught is, I can almost put my finger all the way through the closed die, all the way down through 8 gauge, which is what I have here in a little crimp bit or a little terminal end. Although I do have a couple of quadruple aught, I don't have any wire to crimp it to, and the large size terminals are quite expensive. When it comes to stripping and crimping wire, most common tools go up through 12 gauge, 10 gauge solid core, 12 gauge stranded, so it starts requiring more specialized tools anytime you want to strip or crimp wire diameters that are larger. I don't have any specialized strippers for large diameter wires, but there are a few techniques that you can use to strip them quite reliably. But when it comes to crimpers, there really isn't much of an alternative. Now, I did a review earlier of this Harbor Freight hydraulic wire crimper, and even in its largest capacity and being hydraulic is only single aught gauge. Now, what's kind of interesting about wire is most people are familiar with the smaller sizes as we go from 12 gauge, 10 gauge, right through 4 gauge, which usually is a heavy duty power cable used in cars, maybe heavy duty jumper cables, 2 gauge, which is even thicker, 1 gauge, and then beyond that they start counting it by 0th gauges. So it doesn't go to, say, 0 and then -1 or -2 gauge. It goes to 0 gauge and then they just add 0. So it would be 1/0 would be 1 aught, or 4/0 would be 4 aught. And then that's what would explain some of the, there we go, stranger markings on the dies of these crimpers. Now, if we open these crimpers up, they're kind of heavy. They're like the size of decent sized bolt cutters. Is that these have rotating dies, and that's the beautiful thing, is you always get an equal amount of force, so it is harder to crimp when it's a quadruple aught gauge because that's just such a huge die. But the nice thing about these and similar styles, there are a few knockoffs of this style, is that you can press this button, we'll do it on this side, and then they're essentially 5-sided dies. So you can spin them around. See, that one has the 8 gauge and the single aught gauge. This one has the triple 3-aught, which is actually pretty rare. You don't run into 3-aught very often. We have our 2 and our 4 gauge, our 2-aught gauge, and then our 1 gauge, and then our 6 gauge. So in this little video here, we will be using the 8 gauge. And how that works, this thing's so large it's hard to deal with it in the camera, is it just has these dies. They're held on by a very solid pin that is actually full diameter all the way through, and it connects to a back plate which has helped prevent it from rotating, but most of the crimping force is actually being taken by the solid pin. As the dies get worn out, it is pretty easy to replace them. It's actually a nice feature of these. And I've seen dies that do specialty types of crimps that you can also get for them. Let's go and get this other one set up for 8 gauge here. There we go. One other thing I was going to point out, which is a neat kind of, I don't know if this is standardized, but they do have color coding on each of the sides. So this isn't just printed, but you have these different colored dots, which I always thought was, I hadn't seen that quite much before, but that I believe coincides with the standard terminal fitting color. So if you pick, say, a red terminal, such as what I have here for 8 gauge, then I turn it to the number 8 die, and if we look, if we can get, kind of hard to see, but there is indeed a red dot next to that. I've already pre-stripped some wire, so one of the things, let's go and get that on there, and we'll just do a demonstration crimp. I did strip this a little bit far. You always want to be careful when you're stripping a wire so that it ends right at the end of the fitting there. and then try to push it in pretty far. The idea of these little collars is to kind of cover up the insulation. And let me get this set up here. Here we are, and let's zoom in a little bit so I can show one of the most important tips. Is that all the wire, the terminal fittings, you can see they're stamped piece of sheet metal, and at the top, right next to the 8 on the left-hand side, is where that piece of sheet metal is split. And as far as my experience and understanding, you really want to try to make an effort to make sure that splits right in the center of the die, because it ends up making a more reliable connection. Let me zoom back out here. The nice thing is these are pretty stiff, so you can get a little bit of a clamp onto the terminal so you can start your crimp. We'll start squashing it down, so we'll hold the wire. And how these work is you always go fully closed. If you're using the number 8 die, you just rely that it's the right size, and you're using an 8 gauge cable and an 8 gauge connector or terminal. Those things are about as heavy as, and you just go ahead and squeeze it, and it works pretty well. Maybe not quite as smoothly as the Jensen crimpers that I have for smaller sizes, due to them just being essentially square dies with little cutouts. And what the cutouts do is kind of allow a little bit of the terminal to squeeze out, especially with the plastic installation. But being square, they do get a nice 4-point. And you can see why I would have that on the top, because it kind of squeezes the split together, where if you had the split, if it was rotated this way, when it would crimp down, it kind of want to open that up rather than keeping it nice and tight. Now, the reason that you also close them fully is that ensures that it actually gets a proper amount of pressure. There's actually quite a bit of science to crimping terminals, and what that science is squashing the wires close enough together. And this is all, after, this is aside from making sure the terminal is crimped tight enough to, actually hold on to the wires. There's actually one pretty good YouTube video, a really good one, where they show the terminals and grind them down, and the deal is that the wires are compressed together tightly enough where they act like one solid piece of wire with much contact between all the surfaces, without having so much force that you actually squash the wire and have this artificial reduction where it may be 8 gauge here, but since you squash the terminal so much using a pair of pliers or a vise or something, that you may have effectively turned it into a 10 gauge right here at the edge of the terminal. And termination of electrical wires is where most electrical failures and fires come from. So it's always important to really make sure you have the right size terminal to match your wire, and that you really use crimpers that are meant for that. So in this situation, we can feel pretty sure that the wires are well crimped, but that it still will hold its 8 gauge power rating. And of course, when you crimp with these type of crimpers, the terminals always hold on extremely well. And that's usually the first thing. I've done that with so many friends, is they will put on terminals. I'll just grab it and yank it with a good amount of force, and most of the time I'm actually able to just yank the terminal off the wire. They complain at me, and then I proceed to go on a diatribe about how if I was able to pull the terminal off with my hands, that it was never properly, even remotely properly installed in the first place. So that was just kind of a quick review and overview. I did want to point out one other thing, which is I really appreciate the construction quality. We can actually see that they use grade 8.8 bolts to the hinge points down here, and good quality grade 12.9 socket head cap screws to the main pivot bolts. So these are definitely high quality. These are pretty expensive. At least the Burndy brand, this is like a $250 set of crimpers. I did buy these used, as I do with most tools, to try to save as much money as possible. What is also nice is these can be used for aluminum ferrules for steel cable, but you have to be a little more careful because these are designed for wire gauges, so you have to really make sure that you get the right size cable and ferrule matched up to whatever die size they're using. But the aluminum ferrules won't have any problem. Copper ones, obviously not. But don't try crimping anything that's steel. That will be give you some excessive wear on the dies in there. And really, to my viewers, where this might be most applicable outside of any electricians or industrial millwrights who do, or those kind of people, is obviously automotive. Battery terminals and car audio are always these large terminals on the power cables. And I've seen so many different methods used to attempt to crimp any large terminals, and none of them are really even worth mentioning compared to actually using a real crimping tool. And I've helped a couple people out, and they're always like, well, why, you just helped me install a car stereo. And I say, well, I'm going to bring the proper terminals and tools. You're going to buy the wire and stuff. It'll be a lot more professional. And then when they see this and they see how the terminal crimps come out, they're like, oh, okay. And one last thing to mention is some of the competition, they do try making a change on the style. Some of them have much more rounded heads, although I kind of like the Burndy style because it just seems a little bit more squared off and industrial. But as far as being able to really crimp wire that's above single gauge or single aught gauge, there's just no other choice but for going with crimpers like these or ordering online some specialty type of hydraulic crimpers. And I was going to mention there's obviously cable and crimpers bigger than these, but it's almost impossible. This would be almost the largest size of mechanical crimper. Once you get bigger than these, the tool just becomes too long and too heavy and too cumbersome, and they are pretty much exclusively hydraulic. The prices also shoot up to several $100s for the more specialty hydraulic types. Not that Harbor Freight one, that appears to be like the universal standard. But if you wanted a hydraulic wire crimper that did quadruple aught, you wouldn't be finding that at Harbor Freight. So anyway, that was just a quick review of this big crimper. I wanted to show everybody that there are indeed large crimpers for heavy-duty welding cable and all battery cables and that kind of stuff. And I highly recommend them if you work with those kind of wires, because you really just get a lot more peace of mind. Everything works out better, and you don't have to really worry about the terminals coming loose, and you don't have to, use funky setups, which never even squash the wire properly anyway. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.